if the regime does go ahead with plans to prohibit experienced legislators from running in the next elections for Majlis or president, then that actually may provoke more serious protests. In Egypt, under President Mubarak, there was hope that elections might bring change after the Muslim Brotherhood was able to run many candidates as independents and have them elected to the National Assembly in Egypt. And there was hope that the election of 2005 would bring even more diversity and change to the parliament. But in fact, Mubarak intervened to basically prohibit any independents from winning, and that harsh restriction persuaded many people in Egypt that protest was the only way to achieve change. So I think it would be a mistake if the regime in Iran does something similar to what Mubarak did in Egypt, because if you prevent people from pursuing democratic change, then you force them to seek other avenues of change, including protest, and perhaps even ultimately, as happened in Egypt, a revolution against the government.
سلام جناب پروفسور گلستان، خیلی ممنون این فرصت رو در اختیار ما گذاشتین. خوشحالم که در خدمتتون هستم. همونطور که مطلع هستید اعتراضات و اتفاقاتی در یک سال گذشته در ایران روی داده که برای برخی این گمان زنی رو ایجاد کرده که ما در شرایط انقلابی در ایران هستیم. میخواستم دیدگاه شما رو در این زمینه بدونم.
I'm humbled to be with you at this time of great change in your country, and especially to the young people watching, let me stress that you will make the change in your own country, whatever I have to say notwithstanding. Let me say a few words about myself as introduction. I am an academic, an intellectual. I've never had a position in the government of the United States. I know that our government and your government have had many conflicts spanning decades. And I don't want that to be a barrier to my relationship with any of the students or people in Iran. I've never had a security clearance. I've never participated in national security discussions. Now, I have spoken to people in the US government about Iran at different times over my career. As an expert on revolutions, I was consulted. And I have received money from the US government for my research projects, as most American professors have. But I should say that has not been the case since 2014. Back in 2013, I was asked by US government intelligence officials who I thought was likely to win the election in Iran. Now, that was in May of 2013, when all of the opinion polls showed that Mr. Ghalibaf was in the lead. So I said, well, I think it's likely a conservative will win the election. But in fact, during the debates 2 weeks later, Mr. Rouhani had some important breakthroughs. And in June, he won in a landslide. So since then, the US government has not valued my opinion as a forecaster of Iran politics, which is appropriate. I should say I'm not an expert on Iran. I'm an expert on revolutions and social protest. Now, I've met many times with Iran experts. I have many friends who have grown up in Iran. Many moved to the United States. Some are still in Iran. But my expertise is on revolutionary processes. So if I'm in error about something on your country, please correct me. So that's me. Now, let me say a few words about social change. There are many ways for societies to experience substantial change. Probably the two most familiar are through revolutions and through elections that create a substantial change in leadership. Now, many people in the West think of Iran as a country that is simply led by a small group of clerical leaders, and they think of it as a religious theocracy. We know that that is not true, because if we look closely at Iran's presidential elections, we see that Iran has elected presidents with a wide variety of policy positions, and that many of the outcomes of those presidential elections, from President Ahmadinejad to President Rouhani, were unexpected. And I always tell people, if the outcome of a presidential election is a surprise, so that people could not say in advance who would win, then that's a democratic election, at least in a very important respect. Now, I know the number of candidates are closely watched and limited by the elite clerical council, but we've had presidents like President Khatami, who were more pro-student. You've had presidents like President Rafsanjani, who was very pro-business. President Rouhani had a long history of negotiations with Western countries and proved to be a very effective in-between and very effective president at negotiating a nuclear pact that temporarily reduced sanctions on Iran. So we've seen a significant amount of change through elections over the course of the Islamic Republic. Next election, who knows who will win? I will say, if the regime does go ahead with plans that I'm hearing about to prohibit experienced legislators from running in the next elections for Majlis or president, then that actually may provoke more serious protests. In Egypt, under President Mubarak, there was hope that elections might bring change after the Muslim Brotherhood was able to run many candidates as independents and have them elected to the National Assembly in Egypt. And there was hope that the election of 2005 would bring even more diversity and change to the parliament. But in fact, Mubarak intervened to basically prohibit any independents from winning, and that kind of harsh restriction on what had been increasing electoral opportunity persuaded many people in Egypt that protest was the only way to achieve change. So I think it would be a mistake if the regime in Iran does something similar to what Mubarak did in Egypt, because if you prevent people from pursuing democratic change, then you force them to seek other avenues of change, including protest, and perhaps even ultimately, as happened in Egypt, a revolution against the government. Now, third thing I want to say, what can I tell you about revolutions? That is my area of expertise. And the thing about revolutions is they are not totally rare in history. We see revolutions have occurred for many years all around the world, even where they were not expected. So we've seen popular protests force a change of government in countries as diverse as Armenia and Sudan in just the last 4 years. So it's often a surprise when revolutions occur. They're not easy to predict. But I can say in retrospect that when we look to say, well, how can we explain the revolutions that have occurred, we can identify 5 necessary ingredients. First, the government does something, has a crisis that leads it to be seen as both weak and illegitimate. Now, both are important. A government that is seen as illegitimate but remains seen as a strong, effective government able to use its military and coercion will not be overthrown. And a government that is weak but still seen as legitimate may be shored up by fresh support from elites or the population. It's only if the government is seen as both weak and illegitimate that a revolutionary opposition is likely to build sufficient strength. Now, that usually comes from something like a defeat in war, very high inflation, which is something that Iran is perhaps on the threshold of feeling, an economic crash, spikes in food prices. When a government is seen as ineffective to defend the country or defend the people, that's when it is seen as perhaps ineffective to defend even itself. Now, in a crisis like this, it's also important that leading elites turn against the regime. They come to believe that the existing rulers can no longer defend the country, can no longer provide even for the welfare of society's leading groups. That might be professionals, doctors, lawyers, business leaders, might be government officials. It must include a portion of the military, because if the military remains united and loyal to the government, revolution cannot occur. But throughout history, we see, just like populations fragment and split, so too the military can fragment in a crisis. It may be junior officers turning against senior officers. It may be one portion of the military, perhaps the Air Force or the Special Forces, turns against the government, even if the Army or the Navy remain loyal. In the Russian Revolution of 1917, it was parts of the Navy that rebelled against the government and led to successful opposition in St. Petersburg. So there needs to be some portion of the military that weakens the government's ability to exert coercion. Now, third is the popular grievances that lead to popular support for change. They need to be fairly widespread. It's hard to motivate people to take risks to oppose the regime. People feel more inclined to do so if they feel other people will join them. So the grievances must involve a broad coalition. It can't just be the urban population or just the rural population. It can't be just young people and students. It can't be just workers going on strike. It can't just be shopkeepers. It takes 3 or 4 of these different groups uniting to support an opposition in order to give it the power to stand up to the government. So we need a government that's weak and illegitimate. We need elites turning against the government. We need popular grievances that are widespread. The fourth item is a unifying and mobilizing ideology that's produced by opposition leaders that moves people to join forces against the regime. There has to be a compelling slogan or a story or a goal that leads people to say, hey, yeah, we're all fighting for this. We're all on the same side. Now, it could be as simple as bread and peace if there's a war or a massive shortage of foodstuffs or price peak. So bread and peace was used in the Russian Revolution. In Iran, the motto, the Shah must go, just turning everyone in the society against the Shah of Iran, embracing the goal that the Shah was a threat to Iran's true national interests, and all kinds of groups, workers, students, intellectuals, business people, merchants in the bazaar, clerical groups, peasants who had migrated from the countryside, they all rallied behind that slogan. So you need something that's powerful and unifying. And finally, it's easy to overlook, but it's also crucial that there be international support for change. Now, that could mean that international actors withdraw their support for the existing government. This has happened to many rulers. The Cuban dictator lost the support of the United States. That enabled the revolutionaries under Castro to press forward. The Shah of Iran was encouraged by Jimmy Carter to respect human rights and shackle his intelligence forces, and that shifted the balance of power. At other times, it's the case that international support directly comes to the opposition. And in that case, as with NATO in Libya, the external forces supplement the opposition and enable it to challenge the government. But without some kind of international change that either weakens the government or empowers the revolutionaries, it's difficult for a revolutionary movement to succeed. So those are the 5 things that we look for. Unfortunately, they're hard to predict. You never know when a crisis is going to come suddenly upon you. You don't know in advance how elites will react. Will they support the government, or will they divide and fight with each other? You don't know how broad the support for a popular uprising is until people start to come out into the streets or into their villages, and then you see, does a large portion of the population rally behind them, or do the protests remain limited to the leading group, whether that's a group of youth or women or urban protesters? In 2009 in Iran, you had a huge urban revolt in the major cities, but it wasn't joined by an equally large rural uprising, and that in part allowed the government to wait out and suppress the urban protests. So that's all I have to say for an introduction, and I'm very happy now to take questions.
در خصوص این فاکتورهایی که برای انقلاب شما ذکر کردین، علاقه‌مندم بدونم که کدوم یکی از این موارد خیلی اساسی تر و جدی تر در داخل ایران رخ داده یا وجود داره و کدوم یکی از این موارد رو فاصله بیشتری باهاش داریم یا اصلا روی نداده؟ ممنون میشم اینها رو بر اساس اولویت ذکر بفرمایید.
Again, I'm not going to pretend that I am an expert in Iran. I'm simply going to say what I have been able to learn by looking at the news coverage and talking to people who I know who are better informed than I am. Let me go through this. Many people are certainly seeing the government of Iran as ineffective. Many people are not happy with the degree to which the government has maintained a stance of hostility and enmity toward the West. This obviously has resulted in economic sanctions. It's resulted in harsh travel restrictions. It's made it difficult for people to pursue business outside Iran. So there are many people who think that the government is pursuing a policy toward the West that is harmful to Iran. On the other hand, there are still many people in Iran who view the West as the enemy. They look at the history of actions by the United States that have been damaging intentionally or otherwise, very damaging to Iran. They view the West as immoral, as secular. They see defending Iran to be a matter of defending Iran's role as a leader in the Islamic world. So it's not yet overwhelming that the government is seen as illegitimate on its policies abroad. Now, domestically, the economy obviously has, let me say, two angles. On the one hand, the government of Iran operates a fairly extensive welfare state. There are a lot of government policies that provide education, subsidies, health care, particularly for the poorest in Iran. But the government is also embarking on economic policies that are leading to high inflation. And if Iran should tip into kind of a ruinous hyperinflation, that would much more greatly undermine the legitimacy of the government than anything that's happened so far. If the economy were to suffer, not just the kind of continued slow growth and slow decline, but a major crash, that would also undermine the legitimacy of the regime. So I would say there are some threats to the legitimacy of the regime that are on the horizon, but none that have arisen yet to the level of turning a majority of the people of Iran or the elites of Iran into the belief that the current government is a bigger threat to Iran's future than it is a defender of Iran's future. So not there yet. Now, is the government perceived as weak? There I would have to say the government, I think, is still perceived as fairly strong. The elites, both inside the government and in the broader religious, clerical, and professional community, they may disagree with some of the policies of the government and challenge those policies, but they have never turned against the government per se. Even in the 2009 protests, candidate Mousavi was not willing to advocate the overthrow or turning against the regime as such. He wanted the election results to be investigated and challenged, but he didn't put himself in the role of leading the opposition against the continued rule of the government. It's still the case that this generation of leaders in Iran grew up fighting for and defending the revolution, and I haven't seen any sign yet that they have changed that stance. So that plus the fact that the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij have so far proven loyal and effective whenever they've been deployed, the combination of a united elite and a loyal military means the government is still seen as quite strong. So I think that first condition is really lacking. And the second condition of having leading elites turn against the regime is also lacking. Now, again, if the clerical council starts being much more harsh in rejecting candidates for office, one of the ways that governments often fail is they start drawing a tighter and smaller circle around the people they trust and admit to government. And by pushing people outside the circle, they create elite opposition. So that could happen in the future, but again, we're not there yet in Iran. Now, popular grievances are certainly widespread, and the protests over Mahsa Amini and the women's rights movements have been remarkable for creating unity and courage among a particular segment of the population of Iran. That is, in particular, women, and especially young women, have shown tremendous courage and resolve in organizing online, in organizing in person, in maintaining protest in spite of harsh repression. But that popular protest has not yet spread either to the older generations. Iran right now has a demographic, a population structure, where the largest population group is the age group age 35 to 45. And that age group needs to be swept into revolutionary activity for a broad coalition of aggrieved population to arise. Most of the protesters have been in the younger 20 to 35 age group, which is not large enough to carry the rest of the population forward by alone. Now, a lot of revolutions have occurred in countries with a high birth rate and a very large youth population, so much so that the population age group from 20 to 30 or 35 is much larger than the older age groups. And that large youth cohort, if it takes the lead, is often large enough to encourage other groups to follow them. But when the youth cohort is smaller, as is in the case in Iran, because of the rapid drop in the birth rate from 6 before the revolution down below 2 children per family today, that means the youth group is smaller than the age groups in the middle ages. And so those kind of 35 to 45 become the key segment of the age population that has to join in large-scale protests against the regime. So we're not seeing that yet either. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the ideology of rage against the treatment of Ms. Amini and the women's rights movement is not an ideology that has carried or will carry the entire population against the government of Iran. I mean, it could be that the government of Iran responds to that particular challenge. I understand that the government is putting up cameras in the cities to try and identify people who are not appropriately veiled. But if the response of that is to issue them citations for a fine instead of to swoop in and arrest them and rush them off to prison, well, probably Iran can live with a situation where people can wear the hijab or not, and the penalty is having a fine. If it's, it's a modest one, like having a traffic ticket, maybe some people will do that. But that's not going to be an issue then that will mobilize all of society. And frankly, in a world where Saudi Arabia no longer requires women to be veiled, as of 2018, as part of his modernization effort, Mohammed bin Salman has reduced the penalties and even said, we want women to dress modestly, but we don't require traditional Islamic dress. I never would have thought Saudi Arabia would be the country leading a movement toward leniency on the hijab. But this is an issue where the government could relax its enforcement modestly and diffuse the protests in order to turn a society into a broad revolutionary movement that's willing to take risks against the regime. You need an ideology, a cause, a goal that will unify many sectors of society and really give them an emotional reason, a broad sense of injustice and danger that will turn them against the regime. Right now, the women's rights movement has created that anger and sense of injustice among young people and especially women, but not yet for the whole society. And finally, there's been no great shift in international support. I know that some protesters in the last year called on Western governments to do more to support the protests or to do more to respond to the regime's harsh coercion and crackdown and blatant mistreatment and abuse of protesters. But the international community has not acted. Right now, the international community, frankly, is much more worried about dealing with Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, Iran's involvement in potential and ongoing wars throughout the Middle East. And if the US or France or other countries are going to put pressure on the government of Iran, it's more likely to be over slowing down the nuclear weapons program, working with Saudi Arabia to create a peaceful outcome in Yemen, reducing its support for terror groups in other regions. And unfortunately for the protesters, they have not yet risen to the top of the international agenda. And I'm very sorry to say this because I'm a strong believer in human rights. But when I see how the international community has allowed China to treat its population of Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region, and I see how other human rights abuses in other countries have not produced great international outcry, I don't expect that the brutal mistreatment of protesters in Iran will lead to any great international efforts. And that saddens me, but again, I try and simply say what I see to be happening.
شما در مورد روی دادن دو قطبی صحبت کردین. به نظر میرسه در جامعه ایران ما بیش از این که یه نوع دو قطبی بین حاکمیت و دولت و از طرف دیگه با مردم داشته باشیم، یه نوع دو قطبی بین بخشی از مردم، طبقات مذهبی تر جامعه و بخش‌های سکولار جامعه داریم. علاقه‌مندم بدونم که این نوع دو قطبی در جامعه ایران چه نسبتی ممکنه داشته باشه با روی دادن شرایط انقلابی، با توجه به اینکه این دو قطبی تماماً بین جامعه و حاکمیت نیست و در واقع بین بخشی از مردم با بخش دیگه هستش. ممنونم نکاتتون رو در این زمینه با ما در میون بذارید.
You are correct that one of the signs that a society is heading toward revolution is an increased polarization, a factionalization, a drawing up of kind of warlike hostilities between different groups in that society. So as you say, if there were a really harsh hardening between the religious and secular groups, or a really harsh hardening between the different factions of the military. I mean, if the Basij were to say, we don't want to shoot on innocent women, we're not going to carry out these commands, that would be a serious breach. But again, the polarization has increased because the hijab issue has been a polarizing issue where the conservative clerics have said, we are insistent that strict observance of the headscarf law is essential to the character of the Islamic Republic. And less religious, less conservative groups have said, no, that's not an issue that we want to fight with our people over. You know, we have big issues to deal with. We have to deal with the international sanctions, with the threats from other Middle Eastern countries. Our economy is in trouble. We're fighting inflation. Why do you want to make it essential to fight over such a minor issue? So yes, you're correct that polarization has advanced, but it's not complete. I mean, there are still many clerics and officials who are saying, you know, well, we're not completely in agreement with you. Polarization generally means that the two sides are in lockstep on every issue, so that you'll have a clerical conservative group that agrees with itself on every major policy and other groups, opposition, that disagree with them on every policy. Now here, when President Rouhani was elected, he was a member of the conservative clerical group, but he didn't have their support in the election. He ran on a more pro-international, pragmatic policy platform, whereas the conservative groups were on a more anti-Western platform. So as long as there are a variety of differences over different policies, we cannot say that the polarization has reached a level that really draws battle lines across society. And even on the headscarf issue, some members of the Islamic clergy and the government are much more strict, whereas other members are in favor of treating these as minor infractions and not worth going to war with the entire female population of the country. So is it a line around which polarization could grow? Yes, but I don't think it's a polarization that will reach a fever pitch until other issues like inflation and international relations are all drawn into the mix and start to combine together.
در خصوص استراتژیایی که برای مخالفان برای مخالفت اتخاذ میکنن، بخشی از فضای معترضان به این سمت هستش که ما باید به نوعی با در آوردن روسری یا موارد مشابه اعتراض خودمون رو به قوانین اسلامی نشون بدیم و از این طریق اعتراضات رو زنده نگه داریم. برخی دیگه معتقدن که این روش باعث میشه که حاکمیت از اون ظرفیت حامیان مذهبی خودش استفاده بکنه و این اعتراضات رو به نوعی اعتراض در مقابل اسلام جلوه بده و سرعت تغییرات و امکان تغییرات از بین بره. میخوام دیدگاه خودتون رو در خصوص این استراتژیایی که ممکنه برای اعتراضات استفاده بشه بدونم.
Well, again, Islamic law has always been subject to various interpretations. There are some Muslim majority countries that interpret the law to be more strict on completely concealing the woman's face and body. As you know, Afghanistan is more extreme than Iran. Turkey, which sees itself as a leader of the Islamic world and whose leader, President Erdogan, has claimed that he is leading an Islamic party and that he wants to bring Islam back to Turkey after the secularization of Ataturk. He has simply said, I'm going to make the law allow women to wear headscarves if they choose. And it's not required because Turkey's own national tradition, although thoroughly Islamic, is different. And I already mentioned that in Saudi Arabia, which I hadn't expected, Mohammed bin Salman has said that as long as women dress modestly, they are in compliance with Islamic law, and it's not necessary to cover every strand of hair in order to meet that requirement. So I think there's room for argument. I think if the government of Iran wants to say, we believe in one particular interpretation of Islamic law with regard to women, and we're going to enforce that because we think that's essential for the character of Iran as an Islamic republic, then I think they're binding themselves in a rigid way that may damage the legitimacy of the government. I think women protesters can and should make the point that in his day, the Prophet Muhammad, blessed be his name, was in fact in favor of respect for women, and that the point of his strictures on women's dress were to preserve the virtue of women, not to hide them from society or to restrict their role. So I think there's an argument to be made that the government is not the only arbiter in the world of Islamic law. There are many different Islamic countries, many different Islamic experts, many different Islamic traditions, and women in Iran can simply say, we want to have the same liberties that our sisters in other Islamic countries are now enjoying. And it's not a question of Islamic law. It's not a question of anything except how stubborn this government will be on this one issue. And I think that's probably the most productive way to proceed.
شما ذکر کردید که گروه‌های مختلف معترضان باید دارای یک داستان و هدف مشترک باشن که اونها رو با همدیگه متحد بکنه. آیا این مسئله رو میشه با داشتن رهبر توسط معترضان گره زد، رهبری که بتونه اون ایده ها رو بیان بکنه و یه نوع اتحاد ایجاد بکنه؟ خصوصا این پرسش از این جهت اهمیت داره که برخی معتقدن با سربرآوردن شبکه‌های اجتماعی ما نمیتونیم اعتراضات و انقلاب ها رو مطابق گذشته با داشتن رهبر شاهد باشیم و این یک نقطه امتیاز برای اونها هست. در واقع حاکمیت دیگه نمیتونه با بازداشت کردن یه تعداد از رهبرها امکان اون اعتراضات و انقلاب‌ها رو از بین ببره. در مجموع شما فکر میکنید که آیا نیازی به رهبر برای اعتراضات وجود داره در این دوران جدید و در خصوص شرایط ایران به گمان شما آیا چنین رهبری وجود داره یا خیر؟
Thank you. It's a very important issue because among scholars there has been a recent debate. Some have pointed to the Arab Spring and said it is possible to have movements without leaders, revolutions without revolutionaries in one phrase, or leaderless revolutions. I believe that the evidence is starting to turn against that view. Now, let me explain why I say that. It is true that if you have a leaderless protest, it's harder to simply eliminate leaders by identifying a handful of people and arresting them or sending them into exile. In that respect, a leaderless revolution may be able to resist coercion and survive. However, there's a difference between survival and success. You can have protests, as have occurred in Iran with some regularity. Student protests under Khatami, there were 2009 large protests in Tehran. There were there were rural protests under Ahmadinejad, and now the protests over women's rights. So there's been quite a striking history of protest. But in order to challenge the government, you do need leaders on two different types. So let me clarify that. In my work, I have argued that revolutions need visionary leaders and organizational leaders. The visionary leader is someone who can create a persuasive story that excites people, mobilizes people, gets them to see other elements of the society as their allies in the struggle against the government. That is, you need a vision that will overcome the differences between city dwellers and villagers, between young people and older generations, between religious and secular groups. You need a story that will bring everyone together. This is something that the Ayatollah Khomeini did extremely well, even from his exile in Najaf and then Paris. And having a leader who can unite different groups, in a sense, this Rouhani did in his election campaign. He went from initial polling of less than 10% to winning over 50% of the votes in the election. So Rouhani became a national leader in the electoral struggle. There hasn't been anyone of that stature or persuasiveness in the opposition. I think you could argue that President Ahmadinejad also whipped up popular enthusiasm. He was very vocally man of the people, anti-Western, ran a populist campaign. And he had a period in which he earned his popularity. But again, he was a leader in the electoral competition in Iran. He wasn't a leader of the opposition against the supreme leader in the Islamic Republic. All of the presidents of Iran, even if they've had policy differences and even if they've had their own popular base of support, have not been leaders against the supreme leader. They've been leaders for particular groups or for particular policies. So you need a visionary leader to sustain the kind of mobilization and unity in the face of government opposition that will make a regime successful. Now, you also need organizational leaders. You need people who are practical, who can get out a message, who can establish the day and time of a protest, who can make sure that if there is a protest, that there's transportation, that there's water, that there's supplies for people, the kind of logistics. And if there is a military competition between the opposition and the government, you need someone who can make sure the military is well supplied and well led and can win the battle. Sometimes a single person can be both an outstanding organizational leader and a visionary leader, but usually it takes a team. So in the United States, in our Revolution for Independence, we had Thomas Jefferson and Sam Adams as visionary leaders and George Washington as our great organizational leader. In the Russian Revolution, Lenin was a visionary leader, but he had help from Leonid Trotsky, who was a brilliant military leader and union leader. So you need both types of leadership. And at the moment, most of the effective political leadership in Iran has remained within the boundaries of the government, fighting for positions in the Majlis or in the presidency. And so they've been political elected leaders rather than opposition leaders. Now, of course, that may change, but at the moment, that is where the bulk of the effective popular leadership has been during the Islamic Republic.
بعضی از منتقدا معتقد هستند که جامعه ایران با توجه به سوابق تاریخی خودش مانند انقلاب سال 57 در مواجهه با مشکلات سیاسی و اجتماعی خیلی سریع به سراغ گزینه انقلاب میره. با توجه به اینکه شما هم در گفتگوهای دیگه‌ای که داشتین اشاره کردین که در چند دهه اخیر انقلاب‌ها یا معمولا رخ نمیدن یا اگر هم رخ میدن معمولا موفق نیستن. به نظر شما یا انقلاب کاراترین روشی هستش که مردم میتونن برای بهبود شرایطشون استفاده بکنن یا گزینه‌های شدنی‌تر و مؤثر دیگه‌ای برای بهبود اوضاع وجود داره؟
Yeah. There have been three main ways to change. Well, there have been four, let's say. There are four main ways that governments have been changed. One way, which I won't talk about much, is a military coup d'etat. So you can have a military leadership like Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt in 1952. He led military officers to overthrow the king, and then the military leaders took over the country and created the Arab socialist revolutionary regime. So that's one way, is the military can act on their own. The second way is a violent mass revolution. And these have occurred rarely throughout history, but they've been very effective. When you have a violent mass revolution, if it succeeds, it tends to lead to a government that is very firmly entrenched. This has been the case. The Iranian Revolution was not violent in overturning the Shah, but it had to adopt violence to defend itself against the attack from Iraq. And winning the war against Iraq, that involved a lot of purges and exiles and executions that really solidified the leadership and the military of the Islamic Republic. In those early days, people paid with blood to defend the republic, and people who disagreed, like President Bani Sadr, were expelled or arrested and set aside. So that kind of violent trial by fire for the young revolution helped strengthen it. So violent revolutions are not efficient. They involve huge losses of lives and expenditure. but they tend to produce a very firmly united and powerful revolutionary government. So the military coup d'etat, very common, but usually doesn't change that much. The violent revolution changes things enormously, but is very costly. The third way to change a government is through non-violent revolution. So like the overthrow of the communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the overthrow of the Ukrainian leaders in 2004 and 2014. So these non-violent or color revolutions or urban revolutions, they have different labels, but the idea is if you have large numbers of people representing all kinds of groups in society that are willing to demonstrate in large numbers and to resist government oppression, and if at some point they are supported by a faction of the military, then this large popular protest can leave the government leadership feeling that they cannot defend themselves, that they cannot maintain their will and their vision in popular protest with a military that is no longer fully loyal and no longer willing to suppress it. So in those peaceful revolutions, you end up with the government either negotiating its departure or with the leader of the government leaving the country, and then a new government takes its place. Now that's much more efficient in terms of much lower cost in lives, but the history of these nonviolent revolutions shows that even when they win, because they haven't uprooted the old ruling class, because they haven't thrashed out all of the differences, you often still get a new regime that is not as effective as would be hoped in bringing change. That is, you have members of the old corrupt government, the old corrupt business class that are still there. You have officials from the old government that are sometimes still in power or seeking power. And so the outcome of nonviolent revolution is often a weak democracy, or Russia or the Philippines. Even where you had successful nonviolent revolutions, the subsequent history is continued political infighting, continued struggle with corruption, and some improvement, but not a dramatic transformation as some people might have hoped for. Then the last way to change is by having an election that produces a major change in leadership. We've had some of these kind of electoral realignments. For example, the election in the United States of Franklin Roosevelt with his New Deal, replacing a pro-business president, Herbert Hoover, who said, "I'm against unions, I'm against government spending." And he was replaced by a president who said, "I'm going to defend unions. I'm going to use government spending to put people back to work." So it was a complete reversal in government policy as the result of an election. You had another big change after Ronald Reagan, who said, "I believe in business. I'm going to be an enemy to the unions, and I'm going to support the corporation and lower their taxes." That was another big change. America has never had a revolution. It's had a civil war. But even in America's Civil War, the big changes came about by electing new political parties like Abraham Lincoln. The first Republican Party victor turned out to be the person who abolished slavery. So you can have big changes through elections if the president who is elected has enough popular support and enough power under the rules of institutions to change things. In Iran, all of these, in a sense, are possible, conceivably. A lot depends on, can you elect a president who is strong enough to challenge the supreme leader on certain policies? And then again, the other way that you get change, the fifth way, is if the leader dies. Because if you have a succession crisis where it's not clear who's going to take power after a leader leaves, you can get a major political realignment and change just as different groups negotiate or fight for succession. So I think all five of these avenues are open. It's hard to say which is most efficient. You get the biggest change at the highest cost, in violent revolutions. You get lesser change at lesser cost in other ways. Probably the most efficient is a political election that produces a radical reformer as the president. Maybe the best example of this was the presidency of Cardenas in Mexico, 20 years after the Mexican Revolution, failed to do as much in the way of social change as was hoped. Cardenas was elected, and he put in a policy of nationalizing the oil firms, nationalizing the railroads, distributing land to peasants. So his election carried out many of the revolutionary policies that the violent Mexican Civil War failed to enact. So if you get a president who is both capable and determined to reform, that's probably the most efficient way to create change. But again, that's only happened rarely, just as revolutions themselves.
ما تحلیلگرانی داریم که شاید یه نوع خوشبینی نسبت به آینده دارن، معتقدن که همیشه آینده بهتر از وضعیت کنونی هست. شاید برخی از ادله ها هم براش فراهم میکنن، مثلا معتقدن که در ایران تغییرات فرهنگی وجود داره، تغییرات اجتماعی وجود داره که در هر صورت دولت و حاکمیت امکان مقاومت همیشگی در برابر اونها رو نداره و بنابراین ما شرایط بهتری در آینده خواهیم داشت. دیدگاه شما در مورد این خوشبینی تاریخی چی هست؟ بر اساس تجربه سایر کشورها به نظر شما همیشه این تغییرات مثبت هست یا اینکه ممکنه زمینه‌های مثبتی وجود داشته باشه ولی اتفاق ویژه‌ای نیفته؟
Well, if people are optimistic about the future, they're usually not going to take huge personal risks to overthrow the present because they think a better future may be coming, it may be on the way. And it's certainly true if the population believes that the government will have to come to its senses, it will have to recognize that strict treatment of women is no longer the way that countries around the world are moving forward, that you need the active support and participation of women in a modern society in order for that society to be competitive and strong, then you can believe, yeah, look, sooner or later, even the government of Iran will have to recognize that that is how things are. If people start to feel that, oh my gosh, this government is never going to realize that. This government is never going to change. This government is always going to be holding women down, and that will damage the future of the entire country, and that they're going to sacrifice the economy and the international standing of the country over this issue of treating women, then that negativity will fuel the polarization that will lead to larger protests and either an electoral wave that will create a massive election change or protest and likely some type of peaceful revolution. I don't think violent revolution is likely in Iran because the population in Iran is now older, more educated, and fits the profile of countries that have had non-violent revolutions. That is, the revolutions against communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the revolutions against authoritarian leaders in Ukraine, in Armenia. When you have a population that is led by adults that are in their 30s and 40s and 50s, then you tend to get more peaceful rather than kind of extreme violent ideological revolutions. Those are more characteristic of younger populations. So I think Iran, if the government proves to be so stubborn and so negative toward women that they seem to become the enemy rather than the protector of all that is good in Iran, they will lose the support of the population and you will see a change. But at the moment, I actually seem to hear that a lot of people in Iran think, hey, we've got bigger problems than this. The government should back down. there seem to be some signs that the government is reserving its harsh crackdown for protesters and is no longer treating women as harshly if they go in public without the veil, especially in the larger cities. There are enough women who are saying, you know, heck with it. I'm going to appear the way I feel I should appear. And if the response of the government is to say, well, it's illegal, you'll have to pay a fine, but we're not going to throw women in prison for this, then that's, I think, gives people optimism that, okay, maybe the government is realizing they need to be sensible on this issue when there's so many other dangerous, vital issues facing the future of the country. So, to answer your question, optimism is good. Human beings thrive on optimism and hope, but revolutions usually occur only when large numbers of people have given up hope that the regime that exists can possibly improve and get better. At that point, they shift their hope to a revolutionary movement who they think, this is the path forward to get to the better society I need. I've given up hope on the government we have. I'm putting my hope in a different one for the future. That is when we see revolutions move forward.
متشکرم جناب پروفسور گلستان از بابت نکات شما و ارائه‌ای که داشتید. اگر جمع‌بندی لازم هست یا نکاتی فکر می‌کنید نیاز به ذکر هست ما میشنویم.
I would simply, urge my friends and everyone in your country to treat each other well. That is, everyone should support everyone else as common citizens of a country with a great heritage and an important part to play in the world, and to ask the government of Iran to respect the rights of all Iranians and put a goal of working together to make Iran a strong country and a leader for all of the values of great civilization, beautiful poetry, wonderful traditions in your history, and try and make Iran as good as it can be as one people and one country. That's a lot to ask for at a time when you're facing crises, and it's a lot to ask for when the government is being harshly repressive to some of its people. But I think Iran does have a great future. There are people of Iran accomplishing great things in Iran and all around the world, and I'm optimistic that Iran will continue to make great contributions to the history and civilization of the world, as it always has done, if it can kind of find its center and if the people can find common purpose instead of fighting each other.
خیلی متشکرم از شما. خیلی خوشحال شدم که در خدمتتون بودیم.
It's been an honor to talk to you, and I wish the people of Iran all the best for their future.
خیلی متشکرم. خدا نگهدار.
Bye.